So Dave Smith, this comedian, was just on Lex Fridman. You know Lex Fridman.
Yeah.
And he was making his case against Israel, basically. And I just took notes. We both took notes about like some specific things we take for granted that we wanted to ask you, because I don't know how to respond to it. It feels wrong to me, but I don't actually know. I mean, so one thing he says is like, talking about the West Bank, he's like, Palestinians don't have any rights. Since 1967, they haven't had any rights. They don't have trial by jury. They don't have any rights. So basically the conclusion is, what do you expect? After like 50 years of this, 70 years of this, things are, it's. And he said earlier, October 7th was an indictment of that entire experience that they've been.
That sounds like it's oddly like justification, doesn't it?
Right. So what are the Palestinians in the West Bank entitled to rights? Meaning, like, are they like who's entitled to right? A citizen? Like, what are they exactly?
And not natural rights, legal rights, residency rights.
And what rights do they have?
Well, those that live under the Palestinian Authority, which I explained was established through the Oslo Accords, should be voting for their leadership. Unfortunately, there was one election and never again. Mahmoud Abbas, I think, is now in the 20th year of his 4-year term. And it's true that the Palestinians are appallingly treated by their leadership, by the PA, in the West Bank, and have been subjugated by Hamas since their violent takeover in 2007 in the Gaza Strip. But Israel has nothing to do with either of those situations. We come on to this concept of occupation, and I think the first question you need to ask is, who was it occupied from? To which invariably these people have no answer, because the reality of the situation is that ever since Israel's declaration of independence in 1948, and international law is very clear on what Israel's borders were automatically by default in 1948. Absent there being any agreement to the contrary, Israel inherits the pre-existing administrative lines of the British mandate that preceded it. So the territory that we're talking about was originally Israeli sovereign territory. And then you have to ask yourself from a legal point of view, when, if ever, has that status changed? And the answer is there has never been any form of agreement to change that original status. The underlying status. And what we have seen in the West Bank is a series of legal frameworks, administrative frameworks, first in 1967, when Israel recovered that territory from Jordanian occupation. Israel instituted what was supposed to be a temporary administration.
Wait, sorry. Can I ask a question because I'm a little confused? So that land in the West Bank was given to Israel in 1948?
Wasn't given.
It was It
was. So this rule, called otiposedetisurus, is a rule that is established to create clean lines, stability, certainty, to prevent fratricidal struggles. And it developed to provide that certainty by simply going according to whatever the pre-existing administrative boundaries of a former colonial unit were. So when the new state emerged, so for example, at the dissolution of the former Soviet Union, or with the Spanish withdrawal from South America, this was also applied in Asia and in Africa. And in all of these contexts, the pre-existing administrative lines become the borders
state
of the newly emerging state at the moment of independence.
In a time
and then what happened?
When you're carving up states, like this is the precedent, like a colonial force leaves, we have to carve up states based on boundaries. Where do we draw those lines? And you base it on the administrative colonial entity that preceded it?
So this is in fact a default rule that applies where there has been no drawing of lines or determining of boundaries. So if you think about partition, which was applied in India and Pakistan, there was an agreement on partition that was implemented. The partition proposal that was made before the establishment of the State of Israel, which is not legally binding, it's a General Assembly resolution, which was a recommendation, which was never accepted by the Arab population or Israel's Arab neighbours, so it was never implemented. So absent any agreement as to what boundaries ought to be, the only lines in play are those of the pre-existing administrative unit, the British Mandate. And when you think about the severance of Jordan, Transjordan, which later became the Hashemite Kingdom, the line that we're talking about in terms of Judea and Samaria and East Jerusalem is the line that divided administratively the Transjordan part of the Palestine Mandate from the rest of it. And so when that was severed, this is the administrative line that we're talking about. And it's significant because it doesn't require Israel to state that this is its territory. It doesn't even require Israel to control that territory. And of course, pretty immediately, Jordan invades and it occupies East Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria. And likewise, Egypt does the same with Gaza. So,
like in 1948?
In 1948 and
War,
1949, yeah.
Okay.
And so
they
that's
assume
where
control of of the West Bank as part of Jordan.
and ethnically cleanse it of its Jews. In
Right.
fact, my ancestor's gravestone was taken by the Jordanians and used to pave a nearby road. And this was all discovered when Israel recovered the old city in 1967. But it's interesting because all of the agreements that do exist, the armistice agreements, which gave rise to what people call, the Green Line, or what they erroneously call the 1967 borders, because they don't date from 1967 and they're not borders. This is, in fact, the 1949 armistice line, which was agreed.
Is that Dayan who drew it? Who drew it on the map?
It was agreed by
That green line, though. That's
the Green Line demarcated essentially where the fighting forces had reached at the end of Israel's independence war. And Egypt and Jordan signed armistice agreements which made it clear that they recognized Israel in no borders, but they referenced back to the administrative lines of the British Mandate because these were the only lines in play. So as a matter of fundamental international law, this is the starting point. Then the question becomes, well, what political negotiations need to be entered into to resolve the issues over this disputed territory? And Israel has repeatedly demonstrated its willingness to negotiate over this land. And that's why, when it recovered this territory in 1967, it didn't apply its law, administration and jurisdiction in full to Judea and Samaria in the way that it did to East Jerusalem. And it said, this is the reunification of the city. It is never to be divided again. Israel instituted, and this is now coming to answer your question, a temporary administrative framework in the West Bank where it applied certain aspects of the law of occupation. That does not mean that the territory is occupied. This is the framework that Israel applied until the Oslo Accords, and then we had a new framework with areas A, B, and C that had the blessing of the international community.
Remind me, what year was the Oslo Accords? It was
1992 and 1993.
Yeah. Okay.
So when people say that Palestinian Arabs living in the West Bank are subject to different laws, there are two important layers of that to be aware of. One is, of course, Palestinian Authority law, because they govern areas A and B, which many people seem to be unaware of. But the other is the legal framework that Israel applied, which mandates, for example, that Israel have military courts in the West Bank, in particular in Area C, where it has retained administrative and security control. And that is mandated by Article 66 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, and it is adhered to in order to provide that framework for Arabs who are not Israeli citizens. Now, Israeli citizens are subject to Israeli civil law wherever they are in the world. And that's why you get this differential. It's not discriminatory. It's not apartheid. It is based on whether or not you are a citizen of Israel or not. It's the sort of distinction that every country makes, in that it grants its citizens rights but also different responsibilities to non-citizens. And it is as a function of law that this is given rise to.
A point of clarification, I mean, Area B is mixed Jew and Arab, and it's ruled by Palestinian Authority? I always thought it was A is Arab, B is mixed, and C is Jewish.
So B is Israeli security control, but Palestinian Authority civil control. So when it comes to planning and zoning, or the taking out of the rubbish, which unfortunately the Palestinian Authority doesn't seem to be garbage, doesn't seem to be interested in. Whenever I've been in the West Bank, unfortunately, this is in Ramallah, one thing that is really recognizable is the garbage pile up everywhere.
Yeah. Right. So the PA should be taking care of it, but it doesn't.
Because Mahmoud Abbas prefers to come to the United Nations and slam his fist on the table and play the part of world leader rather than take the trash out.
So when Dave Smith says you don't have rights, like let's say I am a Palestinian Arab living in the West Bank and I'm accused of murder. Like whose court do I go to? Do I go to the PA's court? Do I go to an Israeli court? Do I go to a military court?
It depends where geographically and the individuals involved. So if there are Israeli citizens in Area C.
So how can you be? So sorry, I'm like pretty ignorant. So how can you be an Israeli citizen in the West Bank?
If you are living in Area C, there are what are referred to as Israeli settlements. And this comes to your question about what one says.
Communities, people. Can we just call it what it is? I mean, settlement, it's taken on such a connotation, but it's so, because it's really designated by people who don't go and don't see and don't know on the ground, but it's like sort of this point of judgment. They call it the settlements. And yeah, what were you going to say? I cut you off.
The pioneers here in the United States established settlements. Yeah. All of Israel was a settlement. Yeah. And in fact, the word in Hebrew doesn't have the kind of connotation that you've rightly identified this now has in the English language because of the misinformation war surrounding it. But ultimately, at its core, it's this notion that Jews shouldn't be allowed to live in certain areas simply because they're Jews. Right. And this has bafflingly been accepted and embraced by the international community, not just in Area A, where the Palestinian Authority has ensured that the area is Judenrein, is free of Jews, but now the international community seems to be claiming that the entirety of Judea and Samaria, which, I say as a non-religious person, is the biblical heartland, is tremendously important to many of the people who live there. But all of that is swept aside on the basis that Jews shouldn't be allowed to live there just because they're Jews.
How progressive that Palestine has to be free of Jews in order to be free. Another thing that Dave Smith, because he's been making all these rounds, loves to throw out in terms of speaking legalese and conflating things in legal terms is in terms of the laws of war. He's often saying, unless you absolutely have to do this, when Israel is targeting a terrorist and there's collateral damage, that is murder in the first degree. Murder in the first degree. You're a lawyer, a barrister. Is that murder in the first degree? Is collateral damage in war unintended consequences of trying to target a terrorist and there's collateral damage? Is that murder in the first degree, legally speaking?
Legally, it's illiterate.
Sit with that.
The whole concept, though, of the laws of armed conflict, and this is quite difficult for non-military individuals or non-military lawyers to internalize, is that it is proceeding on the basis that innocents will die. That is unfortunately, horrifically, a reality of warfare, quite apart from the tactics that Hamas deploy with the use of human shields, where they continually seek to murder as many civilians themselves, both on the Israeli side, but also cause as much civilian collateral damage on the Gaza side. And one of the things I would say, I don't know how real these images of children being taken out of the rubble are. We have to take everything coming out of Gaza with a pinch of salt. As I mentioned, this is Hamas propaganda. But to the extent that there are children over the last couple of weeks that have been moved to areas where Israel has identified it will be striking and has issued warnings. Where is the international outcry that Hamas has done this? It's extraordinary. To clarify the application of the law on this, military action that is necessary can be taken. That is the purpose of, conducting armed conflict, all in pursuit of your military objectives. You have to take that action. As I say, that it is necessary. You have to distinguish between civilians and combatants, which Israel does. And
Hamas doesn't
Certainly.
Yeah.
And it's its military strategy. It's its modus operandi. But critically, this concept of proportionality is continually misrepresented. And that is not about balancing casualties on both sides or creating this kind of macabre, well, you can only kill 2 civilians because there are only 2 on your side. That is utterly incredible, untrue, outrageous, but it also serves to encourage Hamas in its use of civilians as human shields, and so it needs to be called out. The rule of proportionality requires that you balance the anticipated civilian or collateral damage as against the anticipated military advantage of any strike. And that is a very delicate balance. It is conducted on the basis of the intelligence that it is known. So all of this is an intention-based analysis, not an effects-based analysis. And it is something that Israel has consistently adhered to. And these are standards that actually go above the requirements of international law. And modern militaries, moral armies, like from the United States, like from the UK, have sent individuals. And in fact, I went into Gaza with a military expert panel in September. with very senior army officers from 6 NATO states who all said we have never seen these measures taken to prevent civilian casualties, to protect civilians, to provide warnings of strikes. And the proportionality analysis that Israel conducts on a strike-by-strike basis is also in that intensity and level of urban armed conflict entirely unprecedented. So for all of those reasons, I'm afraid that gentleman is very badly mistaken.